Are there multiple different forms of pathological demand avoidance in brackets PDA by Richard Woods at London South Bank University, PhD student, and I'm currently on an extended leave from my PhD. So this is probably gonna be about a 10-minute long video where I'm 10-minute long video and a final of a trilogy of short videos discussing how it is okay for there to be other forms of PDA than a pervasive or persistent drive for autonomy. Um, So yeah, I just wanted to point out that I apologise that this video was not put out sooner. I've had other things going on over the last week or so that's kind of got in the way of doing it, and I don't know if I've got time to put out another video this week. So the next one's probably going to be the back end of next week, which is the last week of February 2026. But yeah, let's get on with it. So yeah, I'm going to be using some memes from Sally Cat again. To kind of highlight some points, some things I agree with, some things I don't agree with. I agree with the point here that undiagnosed PDA voices do matter, and that means all of them, um, including those that are not necessarily conforming to a persistent pervasive drive for autonomy. Um, and the point down here about gatekeeping PDA according to diagnostic access is ableist and unhelpful. I'd also point out that gatekeeping PDA to only persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy is also ableist and unhelpful. Um, the simple reason for that is, well, there's multiple reasons for it, but a key one is that persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy seems to be another functioning category, especially with the examples of it I'm being sent to kind of read and engage with. Has not been a particularly pleasant experience to do. But that's kind of tangential. So, on to the next meme. So, the point I want to take here is that people who identify with PDA can tell you what it's like. So that agrees to that equally applies to people who disagree with a persistent pervasive drive for autonomy. Um, so that includes people like myself and people who also kind of critical of that term. So yeah, this meme is actually relatively interesting. It's talking about how there can be different forms of PDA and how they can be less obvious. Um, and that like no single perspective is representative of a complete picture of what PDA is, and that PDA is dimensional. It's important to hear multiple perspectives. I agree with that. It's particularly true. People's views of PDA PDA's views who disagree with persistent pervasive drive for autonomy matter and have equal weight on what PDA could be. So it's important to kind of engage their perspectives too. Um, it's also important to kind of be mindful that if people have strong views and being loud and quite vocal, particular narrow view of what PDA could be, that we should be taking time and care to listen to views that disagree with that kind of outlook. So yeah, this is again the same point that some expressions are more hidden than others. So if you're having thousands of followers or people being told a particular way which PDA presents over kind of ways that PDA presents, those ways that are being kind of marginalised are going to be hidden due to the kind of just the volume and weight of people with pushing a kind of narrow perspective of it. So people who think PDA is different to pervasive or persistent drive for autonomy, they have again they should be given equal opportunity to be heard and listened to. Again, like all PDA needs specific support, no matter how hidden it is. So yeah, this one I'm a bit more. This one's a bit more problematic because there's basically a dichotomy being put forward over actual PDA, and I put that in quotation marks, then non-actual PDA. Um, and I think the actual PDA is meant to be kind of persistent pervasive drive for autonomy, which I have problems with that kind of assumption. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if people like myself are being put forward saying that actually we have PDA and that I'm PDA, like we should be listened to as much as like Sally Cat is. So yeah, kind of. There's also problematic because like we know tends to know that like false binaries are problematic and tend to be not representative of what actually happens. So This is important side I've used from a different talk. So, who decides what is rational demand avoidance is equal to like who talks for or who represents non-speaking PDAs, who represents PDAs with intellectual disability, who represents non-autistic PDAs, who represents PDAs from global majority cultures, such as those based in collectivist-based cultures, and who represents PDAs who are not part of the PDA community. This point is actually quite important because a person should not need to belong to a community to be accepted as having an impairment. So I should not need to be part of the PDA community to be viewed as having to be viewed as being a PDA. This is equally important because we know about the debates around like who talks about who represents non-speaking autistics and who represents autistics with intellectual disability. There's big debates around like do speaking autistics represent them or do the caregivers represent them, and going back and forth and stuff. So it's similar kind of debate around here. Just because a PDA is not part of the PDA community does not mean that they do not have PDA. Anyone who says that they do not, one could quite reasonably legitimately challenge them. So yeah, it's kind of broader kind of ground to kind of challenge it on. So like scientific method is about attempting to refute competing hypotheses. It's not about trying to prove a particular outlook. And that like studies or kind of campaigning or anything that's designed to support a preconceived notion or a belief are problematic. I'll put a link in the description to the Challenge 2019 paper. It's an interesting short letter article if one wants to go and read it. So our general questions around kind of like assuming that basically, how is it scientific to assume that alternative hypotheses to PDA profile autism or persistent drive for autonomy are not PDA? And like, kind of, how is it good practice to assume alternative hypotheses to PDA profile autism or persistent drive for autonomy are not PDA? And how is it inclusive to assume that alternative hypotheses to PDA profile autism or persistent drive for autonomy are not PDA? And so this is a simple thought experiment to kind of highlight how problematic it is to assume that only one hypothesis PDA is PDA and that other hypotheses are not PDA. So this thought experiment is like, what if some people assume that PDA was a profile of attachment disorder, then decide to aggressively advocate, campaign, lobby, and research PDA as a profile of attachment disorder? What would the response be to the scenario? I imagine that there'd be quite a lot of strong pushback and a lot of people making similar points to what I'm making in this video and in other videos and places. And also, just point out from a practical perspective, if you're saying that a person is not a PDA if they do not conform to persistent pervasive drive for autonomy, that has quite strong practical implications that risk denying people support. Because basically, you're stripping a diagnosis away from them, which is being used to underpin support packages. Even though the S&D system in the UK shouldn't operate like that, it's meant to be diagnostic agnostic. But effectively in practice, it's been diagnostic. It's meant to be diagnosis based, which is showing that the current sense system isn't working as intended. But that's a different video. But yeah, if someone has a PDA diagnosis that doesn't conform to pervasive persistent drive for autonomy, and that has been used to provide certain support packages, and you're basically turning around saying that person is not a PDA, you risk stripping them of those support packages, which is pervasively ironic because the entire argument for PDA is a reason why people should be diagnosed for PDA is that you need a PDA diagnosis to receive support packages, which goes back to the point I was making earlier that gatekeeping PDA around persistent pervasive drive for autonomy is ableist and problematic. Well, yeah, it should be blatantly obvious. So yeah, that's it for this video. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for your time. And we'll see me activities for many. 146 long, and I hope, which is equivalent to live long and prosper. So everyone has a good time and has a good weekend. So yeah, it's actually under 10 minutes. So yeah, have a good time.